All right. Before we start the show, we have an announcement and a request. Val, would you want to explain what that is to me and to our listeners?
I would love to, Tim. So we want to hear from you, dear listeners. So we're conducting a survey. And logistically, we've made things as easy as possible for you.
Survey? I mean, I kind of like just pretending I knew what listeners were thinking, but sure, fine. We can do it your way. And I'm assuming that because it's you, that there's probably a short URL and there's probably a nice little Google form that's mobile friendly that listeners can go to actually give us this information.
Aw, Tim, you know me so well. You bet. And so starting today, the survey will be live at bit.ly/APH-survey.
So putting my listener cap on, so we want something from them. We're not going to actually give them anything in return, are we?
We sure are. At the end of the survey, there'll be an opportunity for you to give us your address so we can get a laptop sticker off in the mail to you. And also, you can choose to enter a raffle for some sweet, sweet Power Hour swag.
I don't know who approved this expense, but fine. So this means, I'll take it because we can now kind of get rid of those old branded mouse pads and BlackBerry covers.
No, Tim, we'll leave those to you to still use as your stocking stuffers. This is actually going to be way better. Think comfy, cozy hoodies, just in time for summer.
Hoodies for summer. Good planning. I'll take mine and just rip the sleeves off and kind of rock those analytics guns through the summer.
Your finance bro look.
Yeah, that's right. I think I'm ready. So how long? They've got to do this sometime before summer. So how long do listeners actually have to participate?
Yeah. So the survey opens today, May 28th, and this is 2024, just in case you're living in our future and listening back to some old episodes. And we're going to keep it open through the month of June.
Okay, so if I was paying attention, listeners should visit bit.ly/APH-survey before June 30th in the year 2024 to share their opinions and maybe actually get some pretty cool swag.
You got it.
Sounds good. Now, on to the show.
Welcome to the Analytics Power Hour. Analytics topics covered conversationally and sometimes with explicit language.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Analytics Power Hour. This is episode number 246. 246. 2468. Who do we appreciate? The analyst. The analyst. And there's no better way to make an episode that has a cheer-worthy episode number than to deliver the perfect show. Obviously, to do that just meant we needed to do the analytical work to figure out what that would be. So what kind of analysis should we use? A little primary research, a survey of our listeners, or secondary research, reading up on a bunch of podcast studies to craft the perfect show? Or would it be a job for multiple linear regression? Would there be some way to run a controlled experiment to get the answer? We couldn't figure it out. So instead, we just threw up our hands and decided to do a show about this somewhat regular analytical conundrum. Which analytical methodology is most appropriate for the job? Joining me for this episode is Julie Hoyer from Further. Julie, have you ever had to choose between, just quickly eyeballing a time series chart or instead doing a first difference calculation?
Yeah, more than once.
Awesome. And we're also joined by Mo Kiss from Canva. So what about you, Mo? Have you ever had to choose between a matched market media test and a media mix model?
I feel like I still have PTSD from those terms, so definitely the case.
Just do them both. You got Canva money. Do them all.
Oh dear.
I wish. And I'm Tim Wilson from Facts and Feelings. All right. Clearly, we've all had to grapple with this challenge in the past. So we thought it'd be great to bring on a guest to chat about it and see if we can put some clarity around the topic. Simon Jackson is the founder and principal consultant at Hypergrowth Data, or, I'm sorry, you're in Sydney, so it's Hypergrowth Data. He's held past roles in data product management and data science at Canva, Meta, and Booking.com. He holds a PhD in psychology from the University of Sydney and did a postdoc at Australia's Defence Science and Technology Group, which frankly sounds like it could be a topic for an entirely different episode. And maybe even a more interesting one, but no, I don't think so. Welcome to the show, Simon.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Julie and Mo. Big fan of the show, so I'm very excited to be here.
It's going to be interesting. We're going to have a 50-50 split on the American versus Australian accents.
Oh.
Taking over.
I like it.
So maybe to kick things off, Simon, I think of Booking.com, Meta, Canva. I think, well, those are all companies that have a shitload of data. But they also obviously are very different companies. You had a range of different remits when you worked at each of them. Like, is it even fair to say, without just having you talk for an hour straight, can you summarize the biggest sort of similarities and differences when it came to what the methodological choices were that you needed to make in those different roles as kind of the last X years of your career?
Yes. So anything sub-hour is okay? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
59 minutes is fine.
Perfect. Great. So similarities and differences, the thing that pops into my head, similarities, reality is there's always constraints. Like I come from a statistics background, you learn at university, like you're for this particular problem, and then you get the real world and none of your data fits that perfectly. Everything, you don't have what you need. It's like, so you're familiar with this feeling. You always have to make some perfect choice or trade-off, no matter what method you're picking, I think is super common. And another thing, and maybe the background, is you've always got people to convince or influence or help change their behavior in some way. And the methods you pick, you have to think very much about the end. It's one thing to be like me and have a stats background and talk about some sort of technical method, but when you show that to, say, like a product manager who's never done any stats training, that falls totally flat, right? So I think things that like come to mind is you're always constrained and you've always got to deal with people. But then on the differences front, you mentioned a few of my roles. I've been a data product manager. I was in academia. I've done surveys. I've done the deep stat stuff, done machine learning. It's like the problem and decision contexts are constantly changing. So it's, I have where I analyze something about my customers. Cool. I've got this massive warehouse, like you said, shitloads of data. I can play around with that forever. Or I'm a product manager and there's no about the thing I want to build. I've got to go out and interview with qual method. So definitely the problem decision context. And I would love to chat about that situation with you all. The other thing I would love to hear for you three as well, the other thing is me. My interests changed, my motivations changed, my experience, my knowledge of methods have changed. And unfortunately, I'm sure the more you get into data, the more you learn, there's so much more to learn. And that's the one, right? It's like, it's never ending. So anyway, I'll stop there. I won't hit 59 minutes, but I've probably used enough time.
So maybe keying off of that last part, the fact that you, as analysts, we change and learn more things. And I did sort of slide into the opening a reference to first differences because Julie and I happened to learn about that at the same time, which was like the simplest concept. And I was 20 plus years into my analytics career, never heard of it. So where does that fit? Like the size of your toolbox hopefully is steadily growing over time, but have you had cases where you're like, oh, here's an entirely new technique that either weren't aware of or had not really explored, were vaguely aware of it, and then you found it or you had a reason to dive in and you're like, oh my God, this probably would have been more appropriate on that thing I did 4 years ago? Or the flip side, now that's your hammer and you find yourself walking around and seeing all the world as a nail?
Oh, isn't that the way? The hammer and nail, like, you learn something new and you're so excited and you're like, oh my God, I just learned, I don't know, like at one point I'm like, everything must be solved by neural networks. And I fell flat very fast. But on the flip side, yeah, I know it's painful, right? When you learn something new, like, oh my gosh, that would have just, how did I not know this? I would have loved to have known. That happens all the time. And for me, it happened, I think, more when I became a manager. Because I was not doing the work necessarily. It was like data experts and data scientists. And I'd be like, how are you going to solve this problem? And they came from a totally different background to me, like physics or economics or something. And they'd throw out this method. I'd be like, whoa, teach me about that. I'm like leaning in. I'm like, holy moly. Just if I had known that earlier in my career, that would have made my life so much better. So yeah, I feel that. I don't going to be embarrassing anyone listening who respects me. Don't judge me. But what did you say? First differences?
Yeah. Is that new?
Yep. Never heard that. Never heard that phrase.
Okay.
Yep.
So,
I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe now I feel...
You don't have to have a perfect example.
Yeah.
Makes me feel better.
Great.
Okay, full disclosure, I don't know either.
Oh, good. Hooray.
I just was like, everybody else knows. And I was like, I really need to Google this after the episode. And now it's becoming a real learning.
Well, now I feel like we just have to go down the little side path. Julie, you want to give the quick explanation?
Tim, correct me if I forget some of the situation, but pretty much we were looking at correlation of two variables that we were interested in, and there was like a loose, relationship that was detected, and me and Tim were talking to Joe, who we were working with at the time, Dr. Joe, and he was pretty much like, oh yeah, but that's probably just like spurious correlation, like you really need to use the first difference. And so me and Tim are like, okay, like, what is that? And he said, oh, pretty much.
Well, these were time series variables, right? So that was kind of a key. Yeah.
Thank you. Time series. And he pretty much said, oh, you look at the change between your 2 points, and then you look at the correlation between the change in your variables, which was like, oh, duh, that seems pretty obvious once he said it that way. And then once we did that, though, it was pretty crazy. There was absolutely no correlation at all. They were not changing similarly at all.
That is really obvious.
So it was pretty powerful. Easy
it's
and
like you just
powerful.
eyeball it and you're like, well, they're both,
Right?
in this case, they were both going up over time, but they weren't from period to period. They weren't consistently, when one moved up, the other one wasn't moving up proportionally. The other one may move down.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just, they both were trending upward. So it's not a definitive check, but it's like, yeah, I guess I ran around. I've probably now talked about that like half a dozen times. I'm like, let me show you this cool thing.
It's time to step away from the show for a quick word about Piwik Pro. Tim, tell us about it.
Well, Piwik Pro has really exploded in popularity and keeps adding new functionality.
They sure have. They've got an easy-to-use interface, a full set of features with capabilities like custom reports, enhanced e-commerce tracking, and a customer data platform.
We love running Piwik Pro's free plan on the podcast website, but they also have a paid plan that adds scale and some additional features.
Yeah, head over to piwik.pro and check them out for yourself. You can get started with their free plan. That's piwik.pro. And now let's get back to the show.
But do you know, the funny thing about that example, and I was about to ask Simon about this when we started to delve into the first differences discussion, I do sometimes worry that like maybe not as you get more tools in your toolbox, but I do think there is a tendency to sometimes prefer the more exciting methods. And it's almost like the more experience you get, the more you realize that you should go back to basics. And that's a really good example of like where a more simple methodology is actually stronger than something very, very fancy or sophisticated you could build. But I think sometimes it's difficult to get the data science folks to be bought into that. And it all kind of then comes back to like explainability, right?
I couldn't agree more with that.
Sometimes using a more simple method means that it's more explainable and therefore you can get your stakeholders on board.
Like I have an example to share, just
That wasn't
riffing
really a
with
question.
you.
Do you agree with me? Is that the question?
I can example, Bo, just riffing off that, is when I was working at Booking.com, we had a very like big strategic experiment. So there was a lot riding on the results of this thing, but there was a lot of like noise in the, so we're like, all right, we want to use some variance reduction techniques to help boost our signal here. And I can't remember the background of the data scientist who was leading the project from the technical point of view, but they're like, our data is very skewed, Poisson regression. I was like, okay, sure, if you say so. Anyway, they did the analysis and everything was like amazing. It's like the results were out of control. And so we started presenting them and someone somewhere, and I guess that's a theme we're having already. It's like, it's good to talk to other data experts. Someone somewhere was like, do you check the false positive rate of that approach on your data?
Then your heart drops to your stomach.
Are you sure that's not a false positive? And we went and simulated this technique on the data set. Yeah, the false positive rate was like 70% or something. Like, it's more than a coin flip. You will get a result that looks good. And we're like, let's just dial it right back down to something simple, ditch this whole Poisson thing. And the results were fine in the end, but we did all this assumption checking and everything Oh, so painful. So yeah, like good slap in the face for me and the team, but definitely complex often does not work out in the real world. That's not a question either, Mo, but I thought I'd riff off it.
That's getting to a point that I think drives some of that complexity. Sometimes the data, no matter what you do, it's only going to get you so far. But I think just as a society, as a business society, there's this belief in, basically it comes down to the data maybe is sparse or crap or incredibly noisy. Well, can't you just layer on a more sophisticated methodology, which, I mean, the first time I worked with an actual data scientist, I was shocked on how some of the things that could be done. There are cases where you can do that, but there are times where it's like, no, all you have is flour and eggs. Like, no amount of fancy KitchenAid mixer is going to turn that into an edible cake, right? I mean, it's like you just don't have the ingredients, and so the best thing is to do is say, look, I can mix it up and throw it in the oven, but this is the best cake you're going to get. Are you starving and you'll eat it? So, or is it, no, you really catering a wedding, you need to go out and collect some more data. That was a highly spontaneous analogy that held together.
Wow.
Better than the cake would have.
That's right. But so to that point, I actually do have a real question, guys.
Somebody has to.
When you are facing a new business question, a new situation, and you're trying to determine what method to tackle it, what dimensions are you kind of weighing for your options, right? You think I could do X, Y, or Z to tackle this type of problem. Are you looking at how many assumptions you have to make? Are you looking at complexity of the actual method, like what it takes to run it? Are you looking at, I don't know, anything else that you would have to like balance, the certainty, things like that?
Yeah, great question. I think, I'm not sure if this is part of your question, Julie, but a lot of it is around what's the problem, like what decision that we're trying to make with this data or the outcome we're trying to achieve. I've had cases where a leader might have asked, we need to report on the impact of our business unit. And then you see like data people run around going, holy crap, we've got to figure out this perfect method. Like, when anyone asks what the margin of error is that they care about, they can deal with plus or minus 30%. It's like, cool, let's just pull some descriptive numbers. That's fine. So a lot of it, I think, is around figuring out like, what's that margin of error that people are comfortable with? And what is the decision they need to make? Tim, I feel like you're rearing up. You want to want to jump in? You want to add? Well, just some memories like surface there.
Well, I'm just thinking of when you ask what level of uncertainty, they're like, I want, I want no uncertainty. Give me the best response.
Yeah.
Do you really this is very controversial. And I feel like Tim's probably going to be start shaking and shuddering and need to pull out the soapbox.
We're going to start a little jar, a little coin jar that every time you predict that I am going to lose my shit, you just have to pay into it. And then you get to take half of it out if I actually do lose my shit.
Okay, but I get to spend it on wine, right?
Yeah,
I feel like that's the trade-off. Okay.
Good trade.
I feel like Tim, over many, many years, the reason I say that I feel like you might have a reaction is because you have largely argued that we need to explain uncertainty to our stakeholders so that they don't need to know all the complexity, but you need to start to get them familiar with that concept. And I guess the reflection that I was just going to have is that I feel like the level of uncertainty that you approach a piece of analysis with is actually more of a call made by the data scientist or data analyst. You have to kind of interpret what level of uncertainty the business is comfortable with, and then you need to make more of a judgment call. But like I said, I don't know if you're going to...
Well, but I think the trick is then actually conveying that level of... I mean, when you can quantify the uncertainty, including... I'm a big fan of error bars when reporting test results or, confidence bands, you're making that call. So I think you're right. I think where we get in trouble is when you report the average and then people want to just run and treat the average as the truth as opposed to representing the uncertainty that you've got baked into it. But I don't know. There are methodologies where you don't get, I mean, I guess even if you're doing just a linear regression, you still get, you can quantify the uncertainty based on the adjusted R squared. So, but you then have to figure out a way to represent that to them, right?
Yeah. Like, can you make a decision based off of this? Like, I ran into a situation recently where the result was statistically significant, but when you actually quantified it with some of the other parameters, it was just a linear regression. Some of the other parameters, it wasn't actually an impactful result. And so we had to tell them, like, sure, it's statistically significant. Like, there is a relationship here, but this is actually not a great data point for you to be using to predict what you care about, like later in other projects with other, methodologies. And it was really interesting to have to try to communicate that and like thread the needle of the certainty compared to being impactful. Like, what decision should you actually make? It was interesting. They took it really well.
Response? Yeah, what was the response?
She took it really, really well. She totally understood. She was someone too who has worked with data, I think, a long time in her career. And so when we were bringing up kind of those two aspects to balance, she was pretty comfortable with that idea, to Tim's point, of this certainty thing. Like, she understood that idea enough that when we gave our recommendation, we could be transparent of this was the result, but our recommendation is actually not to like take action based on it.
Nice.
And it went well.
Wow. Show off.
I know. It's, you know what, Tim, give me one win. All right. I got a lot of other ones that didn't go so well.
I was going to loop it way back.
Loop away.
To like your first question, Julie. Loop away. Yeah. Like what else to consider? And it's the person you're with. It's like, and I think that takes time to build that relationship and understand, like, if I show you a regression or like, discuss what incremental means in the context of statistics, are you going to understand this? Are you going to react in a way that is reasonable and logical with it? Or you just be blank face, be like, cool, we're done here. just tell me the answer. That's a really hard part you need to suss out.
So, Simon.
Yeah.
Just having worked with you, and I feel like you did have some like tricky stakeholders that you didn't always at the start, especially have like a really good understanding of their level of knowledge and experience and that sort of thing. Because you were often working with very different parts of the business. It wasn't like you had like one main stakeholder. How did you tease those things out and learn those things in the early stages of a relationship, and try and figure out at what level of knowledge that person has?
Oh, I really, really like this topic. Thanks for asking, Mo. I never get to tell anyone this stuff. I usually, when I start talking to someone about, come in with, all right, I'm going to assume level 0, and I'm going to explain things like I'm explaining to maybe like a high school student or something, somewhere around that. And then I'll start to layer in some complexity. And then I might say, like, let's say I think a regression is suitable. I go, oh, I might consider a regression. And then I'll pull back and go, sorry, I'm not sure what your experience with data is. Like, does that mean something to you? I do that a lot, this sort of give and take with, I layer on complexity and I pull back and check with them. And that's usually how I suss it out. I try to do it more quickly when I start a relationship, and they'll very quickly be like, I've got no idea what that means. Or like, nope. Or they're like, yeah, I've done that before. And then I build up. That's generally the flow of my conversation when I start with someone. I'm curious if you have tactics as well, but that's my go-to.
I love that. I want to use it. I will be stealing it.
Please.
So. It's so simple, but it's like, yeah, that's a nice, approachable way to kind of gauge it.
Well, I mean, I feel like I've had the opposite. I'm thinking of ones who come in with, they've got a hammer, although, I mean, they have a blowtorch or something, and they may come in and say, we need to do a cluster analysis. And they're just like, okay, well, and they're like, we should do a cluster analysis to figure this out. And it's like, well, wait a minute, but a cluster analysis is an unsupervised technique, and what you're asking for is is that right? Like, you don't have a dependent variable with a cluster analysis. Like, and so then you're kind of like, they come in with a methodology.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or I feel like in the marketing analytics, the whole world of multi-touch attribution, it's been a few years, and I feel like there's a greater awareness. And Mo, I mean, you were kind of on the forefront in my universe of people who were like, there's match market tests, there's mixed modeling, there's multi-touch attribution. These are different things, but the marketers who come in and say, you got to do whatever the fancy word is for.
Can I interject?
Please.
No, it's the marketers
this
that come
sentence
in.
will go on for another 47 minutes and never end. So please.
The marketers who come in and go, can you just cut the data this exact way and look at this and drill by this and give me this exact metric and this, and like it is often half a page. It almost always relies on attribution data as well. And it's like, if you just give me these things, then we know the answer. And every time I have to like sit back in my seat and just be like, interesting. And like the reality is I still feel like I don't have a great answer for that. I obviously try really hard to like have a conversation with that person about the methodologies we use and all that sort of stuff. But like when a stakeholder comes in with a very clear idea of exactly the steps to solve the problem or to get the answer, I get terrified. Like
that happens a lot.
Low key terrified. So Simon, I want to know what you would do in that exact situation, because we always use the podcast to solve my personal dilemmas.
Great. Happy if I can, because I think I'm like you. I don't have a perfect answer here, but I can share what I do try to do most of the time. Usually like agreement, because you want that. The natural reaction, I think, is to get defensive, or like, especially if you're a data expert, and you need to guide this somewhere, and usually having trust is like an agreement is a good way to do it. I'm like, cool, great, love that, something like that. Just to help me do this the right way for you, tell me a little bit more, and I'll lead them into questioning. I think another assumption I once made early in my career is that they had no idea what they were talking about and I knew better. I've learned actually there are definitely times people have had better answers than me. So I do want to suss out. I'm like, is this the right thing? Maybe. But as soon as I get a whiff of that's a crazy assumption and not a good idea, which happens a lot, let's be honest, then I'll start to maybe like, I don't know if this is right or not, but I like to flex some of my expert muscles and be like, no, you're the patient in the doctor's room. I'm the doctor here. So like, oh, now I understand the problem. We could do it the way you suggested, but other things that I know that could solve this problem, and just throw crazy words. This is like the opposite of the thing I did before, right? I throw complexity at them and they're like, whoa, I'm in a world I don't understand anymore. Help me. Then it's like and then I'm like, okay, cool. So if there's all these other options, maybe like, let's just check if there's something faster or simpler, like try to appease what they value. Like, here's something that will give you the answer fast with more certainty or blah, 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 and then try to lead them that way. But I can't promise this is going to work all the time, but that's usually the flow I would go through.
I've never thought of a doctor-patient relationship. It's kind of intriguing because we've had their experiences with doctors who do come in with the I know everything and they don't listen to the patient because they assume the patient is, the patient, they hear one keyword and they just key in on it. The great doctors are the ones that say, my instincts are telling me it's totally X, but I have the experience to take a breath and assume that maybe I don't fully understand what they're doing. Because I feel like as an analyst, I'm likely to jump to, I know what you're really asking and I know what you really need. You're asking me for this, that doesn't align with what I need. So how do I navigate out, as opposed to you kind of set it up there that, or with a degree of humility, one, it kind of puts you in a position with the conversation of saying, okay, what you're asking for and what I understand, I'm having trouble connecting some dots. I want to make sure I deliver what you really need, but just help me understand. So that keeps from being a talking down to, that's a stupid request. I do still think, Mo, on the multi-touch attribution, especially when they're like, but we know that the algorithmic model is going to give me the right answer. And it's like, well, what the answer it's going to give you is right, but it's not the question that you're really asking. How can I help probe in a way that I get to your real question, which I mean, leading them to incrementality through a series of questions is a super delicate back
I was
and
like,
forth in
tell
discussion.
me how to do that, Tim. Please tell me how to do that. But, it's funny. I was chatting to a girlfriend the other day who's a marketer, and we had this big thing going on, and everyone is like piling on their ideas in this Slack channel of like, have we thought about this? Have we tried that? What about if we do this? And like, she was so frustrated. And I had this like real epiphany where I was like, oh, everyone does that in that space because there's like kind of not this expert. There is actually expert knowledge about like when it comes to how to do marketing, but it feels like a more creative space. So people are very happy to like pile on their ideas. And I kind of take for granted that in data, most of the time, most of your stakeholders would be like, you have special knowledge and understanding of methodologies that I don't have, and I am going to lean on you for advice about which one to do. And yes, we do have, the odd stakeholder that comes with a very specific ask about a particular methodology. But for the most part, people don't like pile on being like, have you thought about this? Try this, blah, 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 because like, we work in this space that they don't have as deep of an understanding of. And it just gave me this like real profound respect for the job that some marketers have to do in some situations that we grapple with less. And maybe we're less good at handling that stuff because we don't have to do it as often.
You reminded me of a question I ask a lot, Mo, with people. If they come with that really serious question, like method, sometimes I'll just straight up ask, like, what is it about this method that may think it's like worth doing? What's attracting you? And sometimes you tease out totally other stuff. It's like, oh, I got told by this person at that other company what they do, and that's what we should be doing. Oh, okay. I find that's really cool. Just why do you want this?
It has me thinking that some of the techniques, and it's been brought up on the show before, that Julie's analysis template planning, like the importance of having assumptions, figuring out what the assumptions are heading into and every methodology has constraints and criteria and what it does and doesn't do. And that's kind of a lens to understand, to say, well, these assumptions have to hold. Are we good with these assumptions? Like, oh, I'm going to do, some classification technique. Okay, well, that means that we assume this and we assume this and we assume that. And that's another way to back into the discussion. I think it's a way to back into uncertainty too, because it's like saying you're not going to have perfect information. So that means there's always going to be assumptions. I mean, the big assumption is this is going to be good enough to inform my decision. But then what are the assumptions below that? Because if you're wanting to use this methodology, then we're making these assumptions. Do you, my business partner, agree that these are assumptions we can validly be making? And if they say, no, we can't make that, it's like, oh, great. Then we need to talk a little bit more before we head down whatever path we were going to go down.
Can I totally take us off track?
Please. Of course.
We talked about our toolbox and that we all have a toolbox, and generally it gets a bit bigger as we go further in our career. Can we touch on what we mean by different methodologies and like what are the things that are in your toolbox, and also what are the things that you preference? Because we all do have preferences or like methods that we probably lean towards more. Simon, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Not terrifying at all to try and answer that. What do we mean by different methodologies? That one, I think I said earlier, like my background sort of inferentially, like I go down even further. It's really in like correlation-based techniques like linear regression, structural equation modeling, and these sort of things. But there's a whole world of other techniques that I was just good at. And then I got into machine learning for a while. I'm like, oh, okay, like the supervised versus unsupervised is a whole other way to slice things. And so I'm not sure how to easily define or describe all the methods. I might call out one split, which I like, which I think is, maybe it's my experimental background, but I think it's underappreciated, is like the differences between how you get data, like how you control the world and eventually analyze that data. So like experimentation is a method of controlling the world, but then you can use a t-test, you can use a g-test, you can just look at the differences of fancy stuff.
It's been a moving target for me, so I'm cheating a little bit, and that this is actually in the book that coming out January 2025. That the latest way that we're organizing it, it's literally 3 levels. That you have anecdotal evidence, you have descriptive statistics, and then you have scientific evidence. So anecdotal would be, could go everything from I personally had an experience and it seemed like this is the case. It could be I casually asked some people. I think you would even put a focus group would be anecdotal. Descriptive gets into when you're starting to apply a level of statistics to it. So Dr. Joe, like even saying linear regression even is still descriptive. And currently we're kind of saying scientific is when you do a controlled experiment. So that's the gradations of different methodologies, and you could kind of bucket anything into it. But now that's like hot off the presses. It's not even on the presses yet. So, I mean, boy, Simon, if you've got a hot take on that one, I'd love it. Because I think it's challenging for people like Simon, frankly, and Dr. Joe Sutherland that have been doing this in so many ways. It's hard. I feel like you guys struggle to say, here's like a simple organizing framework, because there's just so much in your brain and you just kind of are able to access, you head down the right path. It's a really tricky question to answer. But hot take, feel free to.
So my brain is generous, but I'll take it, Tim. Thank you. I love that. It reminds me of the hierarchy of evidence, right? It's really like that pyramid structure. So I like that mapping. I had not thought about it like that. I usually think about methods of manipulating something. So I have on one side of my brain are methods of manipulating the data that I'm gathering. Am I controlling something about the environment through an experiment? Am I gathering data through a survey versus a machine recording an event? So like I have one half of my brain is what's the form of the methods I have to gather data and control things? And the other part of my brain is like, okay, I have data. What are the methods that I have to analyze and manipulate that data to get to some outcome or answer? So that's how I split it in my brain. Yeah, it's really hard. It would be great to have something simpler to explain.
Can I ask?
Please.
So it's interesting too, because would it be fair to say that we may actually all be talking to more in the inferential statistics or causal inference space? Because I actually was just talking with some of my colleagues about this topic, and one of my colleagues actually categorized it as he was saying, and it reminds me what you just said, Simon, about like you were thinking about how you control and like gather the data, and he was saying, what do you want from the outcome of the data? And he was saying he splits it in, are you trying to predict individual outcomes or are you trying to infer something? So he was even splitting it as like inferential and predictive in big kind of buckets that way, which was totally like, oh, I didn't think of that. And then I went down this whole rabbit hole. So then, Tim, when you brought up your hierarchy, would that be more applicable to just the inferential side? Would that apply to predictive? Like, it's kind of funny. You can categorize and bucket these things in so many ways.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know. I mean, because I even go back to, it's like the ugliest little diagram, like the scikit-learn algorithm cheat sheet that sort of walks you through, what do you have and how much data do you have and what are you trying to do? And do you wind up is it a classification problem or a clustering problem or a dimensionality reduction problem or a regression problem? And it's just kind of a decision tree. But I think to both of your points, that's actually just organizing within one bucket of the grand universe of methodologies. And it sort of starts with what is the data that you have. Like, it doesn't have anything in that bucket of, to do this, I can go and collect data. And if I know what outcome I want, it can influence which data I would need to collect. Yeah, nice question, Mo. Just like life, the universe, and everything, go. Anybody have an answer?
Yeah, pretty much.
I was thinking, as Julie and Tim, you were speaking, like I think we're better at classifying problems with these methods. Like Julie, what you mentioned your friend talking about, it reminded me, I cannot remember the name. It's a very canonical paper that describes the two worlds of algorithms, statistics, sort of algorithmic prediction. And it was sort of foundation for the discussion between inference and machine learning. It's a great paper, but I'm sorry, I can't remember the name or who wrote it. But those are different because regression, like I learned regression as a actual technique. I learned regression in the context of you have p-values on every coefficient and you add and remove independent variables to understand, can this explain additional variance as a hypothesis? And then I went to the world of machine learning and they were using regression, but there were no p-values, there were no confidence intervals, train and test sets and accuracy measures. And so the method is solving problems. I'm very good at classifying the problems, but can we bucket the methods. I don't know. I find it really hard to do that.
So maybe it's you have to define your problem up front and
Oh,
classify
shocking.
that.
Shocking.
And then based on your assumptions and available data and your stakeholder, a lot of variables under there, then you decide on your methodology. I mean, is that where we're landing? Kind of?
I mean, there's the other way to look at it, and this is going to be another. I'm writing the book with him, so I'm going to have Dr. Joe on my brain all the time. But his like, I mean, this even goes to talking to business stakeholders. Like, what's your dependent variable? Do you have a dependent variable? If you have a dependent variable, then what are your independent variables that you're considering, and what is your unit of analysis? Because if your unit of analysis winds up being a person, well, that may get you to sort of predictive at a person level. If your unit of analysis is time or a channel or something, that may be more that you're just trying to get just a little more inferential, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I'd be using these words right. I'm a fraud. That's it. I'm coming out of this episode realizing that I have no business being an analyst at all. I know nothing. Thanks.
I don't think that's something the quintessential analyst would ever say.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Michael's not even on the show.
Yes.
Nice one.
That's $5 in the swear jar. Well, on that note, I actually am now in my role as the poor man's Michael Helbling. I'm realizing that we are actually at a good on the time front. We need to start wrapping up.
Wait.
Which means there's
Can we please ask
always
one more?
either Mo or Julie has one more question.
Julie, I love that you were like channeling the inner me. This is amazing.
Those inspired me to always ask for at least one more question. No, because, okay, you have gotten to have a lot of great experiences working with really smart people, and you've gained so much knowledge yourself. And if you were to give advice to newer analysts, younger analysts, people newer in the space, what would your advice be on how to actually go learn about some new methodologies, or any pitfalls around this crazy, scary world of methodologies? Because you always feel like a fraud because you realize there's more to know, and you know what I mean? Like, you're never going to know it all. So advice for a young analyst listening to this, or having to choose methodologies in their job.
That's a great one. I think the one piece of advice I always give the people I've mentored or coached is do it in the context of something practical. Like, I spend a lot of time, this is super nerdy, but like I read like statistics textbooks. And while that might have increased my like knowledge in certain domains, really putting these things into practice at your job or on a project is where you're going to learn the most about the strengths and limitations of those techniques. So always try and focus your learning setting. That's like the first thing I think of. The second thing, and we've talked about it a lot so far, is even in this discussion, we've learned from each other. Go and get involved in communities, and they don't have to be more advanced than you. They don't have to be more experienced. It's usually just they have a different background. They see the same techniques from a different perspective. They know different techniques. Even, like I said, us here with all our experience teaching each other. So find a community. If you don't have it at work, there's heaps online. Talk to people about different methods and try and apply those methods in a practical setting. I think they're probably the two things I would start with.
I feel like there's a third one, which was because you said when you were coaching or mentoring people that there is having somebody who actually does have the more experience. Like, it's really hard to be, I've talked to people who've said this, it's hard to be the lone data scientist at a company as a junior data scientist and grow effectively. One, it's terrifying, but two, you just don't have somebody to say, here's another tool for that, your toolbox. Here's another tool for that toolbox. I feel like that was less the case for when I was coming up as an analyst. It was a little easier to be maybe there's just less breadth of things to know, but because you can, like Julie, to your point, like you can take a wrong turn. You can do something that's profoundly wrong, and that any checklist you're following, it's going to take somebody who's seen it. It's like, whoa, you can't do that. I know why you think you can do that. Here's why you can't do that. Now you have that knowledge and you'll never do that again.
I like it. Yeah.
So I feel like there was a third one. You kind of opened it with it. You just didn't realize you were opening with it when you said that it was analysts you were coaching or mentoring.
Yeah. So find an experienced mentor, bounce off peers, and put your knowledge to practice.
Nailed it.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So we've got to head to wrap. But before we wrap up, we always like to do our last calls. We go around the horn, have everyone share their last call, something that they found interesting or think might be of interest to our audience. And Simon, you're our guest. Would you like to kick us off with your last call?
Oh, yes, please. So this week I read an article in the Harvard Business Review. I think it just came out. It's called The Myths and Realities of Being a Product Manager by, I'm thinking my pronunciation, Apurva Mishra. And yes, I know it's about product managers, but first of all, it starts with a very fun jab at social media influencers. So, if you want to laugh, have a look at that. But then it goes really deep into the skills and the reality day-to-day skills product managers need. And one of them is data skills. And he talks about, and just for context, he's a senior PM at Amazon. And he says data skills for PMs today are table stakes. As far as saying they need to be able to do SQL.
Yep.
And yeah, I expect many listeners to agree with that. But it got me thinking really deep. Side of those of us who have data expertise, who teaches these other people these skills? Like a histogram, who teaches anyone what a histogram means? I'm like, I learned that in Stats 101. Who teaches a product manager? I had to figure it out. So I got thinking really deeply about how do we educate other people on the table stakes skills, and also where's the line? What's table stakes for other people and other cross? PMs should probably know how to interpret graphs and maybe run SQL, but probably not regression, right? So where's that line? Anyway, I thought it was a great article. Great, either want to be a PM or you work with PMs, especially from a data point of view. That's me.
Interesting. That could be a whole other episode. I have thoughts. I will swallow them right now.
Great.
And instead, Julie, what's your last call?
My last call is actually coming from a conversation I recently had with Mike Gustafson. We were at work in the kitchen chatting, and we were talking about some announcement had come out about ChatGPT. I mean, when is something not coming out about that recently? And he was just telling me that he had come across this really great YouTube series on neural networks. And I had said, oh, I would love to check that out just because I wanted to learn more about them in general. And it's by 3 Blue, 1 Brown. And it's 5 chapters total. And it's pretty simplified. It brings it back down to how the math actually works, which I love. That spoke to me where I was like, okay, I can grasp this. And it was just really helpful, really simple, and it wasn't a crazy amount of time. So if you're looking for some helpful, information out there to get you started down that road of learning, I highly suggest.
She's says the master's degree in applied mathematics, says it was pretty straightforward. It was easy to follow. So I'm just going to throw that little caveat in for listeners who think they're about to dip their toe into a pool that's going to be a lot deeper than they think it is. Mo, what about you?
I just had so much inferiority complex or imposter syndrome when you said that, because I was like, holy shit, everyone on this show is really fucking smart. And as you were talking about histogram, Simon, I was like, well, I kind of taught myself that, or if I got really confused, I'd ask my sister. Definitely did not learn about it in stats. So just a reminder to everyone out there, imposter syndrome is always a thing.
Always.
Okay. Hopefully by now everyone has worked out, I get really obsessed with one thing for a couple months and I get really into it. And the thing that I keep banging on about at the moment is the Acquired podcast. I cannot stop listening. It is the only thing I'm listening to at the moment. I've stopped even listening to news because I am such a big fan. And I did talk about the Acquired podcast previously.
They're really long episodes, right?
They're 5 to 5 hours. Yeah.
Oh,
and I think that's why I enjoy them, because they go into so much detail. They do analysis on the companies. And I previously mentioned the LVMH episode, which is hands down one of the best episodes of anything I've ever listened to. However, I have had on my reading list for years to read the book Shoe Dog by Phil Knight about Nike. And part of the reason I wanted to read it so much is because I wanted to listen to the Acquired podcast episode on Nike, which I have just listened to, and it is an absolute banger. Now, the reason, look, I do recommend the book. The book is fantastic. Standalone, fantastic read. However, the thing that I probably observed the most about the Nike episode that I really enjoyed from the Acquired podcast was some of the stuff they went into on the marketing side, because like the book ends kind of very early in the history of Nike. It talks a lot about like the relationship that they had with athletes, you know, the fact that Phil Knight didn't really believe in marketing, but actually he was doing basically partnership marketing by working with these athletes, the whole deal with Michael Jordan and how that has kind of revolutionized sports marketing. But then it takes you through like where they are today from like a brand marketing perspective, and how like, you know, when you see Nike advertising, it's quite aspirational and inspirational. And anyway, I just loved it. Loved it, loved it, loved it. I love the Nike brand even more. I am, big fan. And Tim, over to you.
So this is going to be out of character. Mine's going to be like short. It's also a YouTube video. It's only 6 or 7 minutes, I think. Maybe 16 minutes. I don't know. But there's a guy named Doug Neal who does sketched visuals of books. He does sketchnoting, which is just the sketching for taking your notes. So he did Thinking in Bets, Annie Duke's seminal work, speaking of uncertainty. But he basically stands there. It's kind of like when Rand Fishkin used to do his little Friday sketch things. But this guy is an absolute pro, and he basically sketches every concept in the book, and he turns and talks to the screen, and then he draws a little tree and talks about potential outcomes. And I kind of headed down a path. Like I had not heard of sketchnoting, but he sort of he's done other books and done other things, and he teaches people how to do sketchnoting. So,
ooh, that sounds so cool.
All right. So, Simon, thanks again so much for coming on the show. That was a great discussion. No show would be complete if we did not thank our producer, Josh Crowhurst. Actually, Josh will not have edited this episode because Josh is getting himself hitched. So congrats to Josh and Gina. We are soldiering forward. If you've noticed any glitches in the quality of this final recording, it was not Josh's fault. The music was still all Josh.
Please send all feedback directly to Josh.
All feedback directly to Josh. So we love to hear from you. If you have struggled with analytical methodologies or have obvious tips that we missed, reach out to us on the Measure Slack, on LinkedIn, on X if you must. This is coming out right before Marketing Analytics Summit. So if you're going to be at that conference, then please stop by and say hi. Don't be like some people who somebody emailed me today and said, I saw you across the room at Adobe Summit and I didn't come over and say hi. I'm like, why? Because he's like, well, you seemed like you might be a jackass. But no, that wasn't his response. But please, we'd love to see you. Hopefully we'll be out and about at other events over the coming months and years. So with that, no matter what methodology you're picking between, whether it's running a controlled experiment or whether you're doing a mini batch k-means test or whether you're doing an SGD regressor or doing something else that I've never actually heard of and know nothing about, you should always use that data and keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening. Let's keep the conversation going with your comments, suggestions, and questions on Twitter at AnalyticsHour, on the web at analyticshour.io, our LinkedIn group, and the Measure Chat Slack group. Music for the podcast by Josh Crowhurst.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
I love Venn diagrams. It's just something about those three circles and the analysis about where there is the intersection, right?
Simon, one of the reasons that I empowered you under the bus for this episode...
Never heard that. Julie, did you see I had you as the rock flagger?
Yeah. Feels like my name's been showing up there quite a bit.
I agree with Tim, though. The who starts the show prep doc yields the power.
True.
So just to Michael Jordan or Magic Johnson?
Michael Jordan.
Okay. So you watched The Air? Have you watched Air?
That was Jordan.
Yeah.
That was Jordan?
Yeah.
That was Magic Johnson.
No. It's Michael Jordan.
Yes, I'm right. I am so right. It is Michael Jordan.
Okay.
That never happened.
Oh, you know what? I'm mixing it up. I'm mixing it up with, you're right. I'm mixing it up with what, that's,
Okay, Tim's.
yeah.
Tim, you're slipping.
I'm totally
I'm
mixing
shocked.
it up with the other
one about Michael
show.
Jordan.
Yeah, there we go. The other, no.
Anyway.
Rock flag, and how do you even bucket them?